Hello, and welcome to another episode of Team Blush. This is episode 5 in our KA24E Turbo series that we have been doing on the channel. In the last episode, we were working on the electrical system, and in this episode, we will be upgrading our fuel system. In order to compensate for the extra oxygen that we will be pushing into the motor via our turbocharger, we will be upgrading the fuel flow that we will be pushing as well. We will be achieving that with this Deatschwerks 255 fuel pump. This is like your Walbro 255, but this is from a company called Deatschwerks. And in order to control that upgraded fuel flow to our motor, we will be upgrading to a newer style and larger fuel regulator from Tomei. And then lastly, in order to install our new larger fuel regulator, we will be using this adapter from ISR Performance to do so. Theoretically, this should be a pretty straightforward video, but you know how that always goes in terms of doing projects on your car. We shall see. First off, we're going to go ahead and start installing our Deatschwerks fuel pump. First thing we need to do is get into the trunk of the S13 and begin removing our fuel sending unit. We will see you there. Jumping right into it here, we are actually going to be doing a voiceover for the entirety of this video by request of some viewers of the channel and kind of out of curiosity ourselves in terms of how it's going to do with our workflow. So let us know in the comments whether or not you like this style or you would like us to continue talking to the camera in the moment while we are working on the vehicle. The first steps to getting the fuel sending unit out of the car here are to take off these two covers, one for the wiring harness plug right there, and then the other to actually take off the cover that fits over the fuel sending unit. And with those bolts off the cover, we can go ahead and take that plug off and set our cover aside. With our cover off of the fuel sending unit, we can go ahead and start attacking these hose clamps that are connected to our inlet and outlet hoses for our fuel sending unit. And with those hose clamps off, we just went ahead and pushed the hoses off with a big flathead screwdriver. Whatever works for you, this seemed to work the best for us. Hindsight is 20/20, but in the moment while doing this little project, we thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and mark one of the hoses and one side of the fuel sending unit, just to make sure we didn't mix anything up during the process. Honestly, looking back though, it would have been very hard to actually mix up which hose went onto which inlet or outlet, so probably just a little bit of extra caution on our part. You can do it if you want to, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. And with that last hose off, we can go ahead and get these 6 bolts off of the sending unit, and then we should be able to remove it from the tank. Alright, so now begins the nerve-wracking bit of trying to get this fuel sending unit out of the car without breaking anything. Make sure to put anything aside that could potentially fall into the fuel tank. Take it slow and easy. The float and little float arm for your fuel tank gauge is very fragile. We tried the best we could not to bend that or mess that up in any way that we could. So just keep that in mind when you are taking out your own fuel sending unit. A little added protection here, we just put a little paper towel over our fuel tank and put some stuff on it to make sure that nothing was going to fall in the fuel tank while we were working on the fuel sending unit out of the car. And as you can see, here is that fuel sending unit. The sock was completely filled with rust and other nastiness. Right here, we're just showing the positive and negative leads that go onto our fuel pump. We're actually going to be cutting these and getting them ready to put onto our new fuel pump. And as you've seen, we just took off that bottommost hose clamp that connected to the fuel pump, and that allowed us to simply slide the fuel pump out of its little area right there. With the fuel pump out of the way, we can go ahead and get this hose off. A new one does come in the kit, so we don't have to reuse that. With that off, you can see our bare sending unit ready for our new Deatschwerks fuel pump. Diving into our Deatschwerks fuel pump kit here, we have our actual pump there on the left, some accessories in that little middle package, and then our spec sheet right here. Let's go ahead and get the fuel pump out of the package. And you can see just how much smaller this fuel pump is compared to the one that was in the vehicle. Cutting into our accessories package, we have our plug. We have the rubber isolator that goes on the bottom of the fuel pump. We have our new hose. Like we said, we do not have to reuse the old one. There is a new sock, which, as you've seen as well, we need a new one of those. And if you're doing a fuel pump replacement, just go ahead and replace the sock as well. And then while we were getting into the instruction manual, this little Deatschwerks sticker fell out, so that was kind of a nice surprise. And as you can see, there are the instructions. Our next little segment here didn't really need to get filmed in the order that it did. We're just showing you how to go ahead and put this new pump together. But the way that we ended up installing it, we had to do this all again anyways. So as you can see, we took off that little nipple on the outlet for the fuel pump so that we could go ahead and get this new hose on there. And then we put our hose clamp on there and get it tightened down. After that, we'll go ahead and get our plug installed on the pump. And then we'll go ahead, flip it around. There's a little cap on the port where the new fuel inlet sock goes. Here is our brand new sock, free of any nasty rust. There's that little green nipple on there. You just had to take that off. And it indexes just like this onto the fuel pump. With that indexed, you need to take this very tiny metal shim, not really sure what to call it, but this little metal star piece, I guess, and that is what is going to index on this little plastic piece right here, and you'll just force it over the top of it with a flat-headed screwdriver, and that's what retains the fuel sock onto the pump, like that. Finally, there is this little rubber spacer. This will just sit over the sock like so. And like we said, this all gets done again as we actually put it onto the fuel sending unit. With that said, you can see that we did indeed take that hose back off and just sprayed a little WD-40 on it so that we could feed it onto that hard line there on the sending unit itself. You'll see right here we had a bit of a brain lapse and only installed one hose clamp onto our hose before trying to muscle this fuel pump assembly onto the sending unit. You'll see with the power of editing, another magical hose clamp shows up later on, but it's really as simple as just muscling this hose over the top of the fuel pump here. Now we're just going to go ahead and strip the wires on the fuel sending unit as well as the wires on our new plug and get them ready to splice together with a little solder connector. Something that doesn't come with the Deatschwerks kit is a connector that for sure is resistant to fuel. That's something that I would like to see with the Deatschwerks kit, honestly, because it's probably not going to be an issue, but the connectors that we use don't necessarily say that they're fuel resistant or not, so over time they may degrade and may lose connection. Just a little nitpick there. And with those solder connections together, you can go ahead and get the wires up out of the way as best as possible under that little hat. Just trying to keep it out of fuel as much as possible since of the unknown condition of those connectors in terms of fuel degradation. And as you can see, with it plugged in, it's nice and ready to fit back into the tank. Getting it back into the tank, we just temporarily put in a few of these screws to hold down the sending unit and put our hoses back on to get our hose clamps on so that we can go ahead and test it, make sure that the fuel pump is running and that we are good to go with putting everything back together. Cutting away from the voiceover here for a second, we've gotten the fuel pump in the tank and it should be all ready to go. We're going to go ahead and attempt to prime it. Should be able to hear it, which yes we can. So we're going to prime this a few times. And once more. Now, let's see if the car starts. Alright, so the car starts. It sounds like we've gotten the fuel pump successfully installed. We're going to go ahead and look for leaks while the car is running, and if there are no leaks, we're just going to go ahead and button everything up, and we will jump right into the fuel pressure regulator install. Amusingly enough, after having fully pressurized our entire fuel system, we then had to go back and depressurize it. The easiest way of doing that was just to come to the fuse box here, find the fuel pump fuse and take it out. It's the 15 amp fuse that you'll see us pull. And with that fuse out, you can just go ahead and try to turn over the vehicle for a good 30 seconds, I want to say. We did it off camera, but just try and turn the vehicle over, and that will completely depressurize the fuel system. With the fuel system no longer under pressure, we can follow along the fuel rail here to find our original fuel regulator that we will be replacing. It is held on by two screws right here and on the underside. They are very hard to remove. And there is also a fuel line hose right here, and hidden back behind there is a vacuum line. This is just another angle to show you the fuel pressure regulator. We wanted to be as thorough as possible because it's kind of hidden behind everything. And the next steps here are to actually get the fuel pressure regulator off of the fuel rail. We opted to use a little bit of WD-40 on those two screws that hold the fuel pressure regulator onto the rail, and we just let that sit for a little while to get rid of any stubbornness that may have occurred with the years it's been on the vehicle. And then after letting that sit for a while, we came up with the idea of putting a Phillips head bit into our ratchet here. And full disclosure, we did break the screws loose off camera, but as demonstration, we showed you how we managed to do so. Much like our manual transmission swap video, it required some pretty tight angles to get back behind the motor and in all of those hoses, but that was the way that we got that top screw out. And then this is how we maneuvered our ratchet to get to this bottom screw. Very frustrating, which is why we did it off camera, but as you can see, it is possible. After getting those two screws just loosened, we went about getting the hose clamp for the fuel line taken off and that hose taken off along with it. We figured it would just be a lot easier to do without that fuel pressure regulator just hanging once we took out those screws. So we just get that done really quickly here. With that stubborn hose out of the way and the screws on our fuel pressure regulator cracked, we went ahead and grabbed a little stubby screwdriver, just a Phillips head, and we zipped these two screws off so that we could pull the fuel pressure regulator off of the fuel rail. And you'll see a little bit when we pull the fuel pressure regulator off of the fuel rail, it dumps a ton of fuel down onto our hand and down into the engine bay. We depressurized the fuel system and we cranked the engine for quite a while, So you may get a rag ready if you're doing this yourself. There was a lot of fuel and we were not expecting it whenever we finally pulled the fuel pressure regulator. Last thing to address here is the vacuum line that is still connected to the hard line on the engine. Keep in mind where this vacuum line is pulled from, because this is where we're going to be routing our new vacuum line for our new fuel pressure regulator. Here we're just giving you a quick look of the fuel pressure regulator out of the vehicle, not hidden by anything, and you can see where that vacuum line goes. Now, before installing our ISR adapter that goes where our original fuel pressure regulator went, we're going to go ahead and get our new fuel pressure regulator all set up to go into the vehicle. In the little kit here, you get some AN fuel lines. We're not going to be using those. We'll be using these instead. They're just your standard fuel line fittings. Then you have the actual Tomei Type L fuel regulator itself. A very nice piece, and make sure if you're getting this that it has this serial number on the back. That signifies that it is an authentic Tomei product. This piece of paper here is also a certificate of authenticity. And this little card here has a QR code on the back to download the installation manual so that you don't have to attempt to read Japanese. And that is everything inside of that box. The other accessory that we got to go along with the new fuel pressure regulator is this gauge. So let's get right into setting up the fuel pressure regulator for mounting on the car. The fittings come with Teflon tape already installed on the threads. So you'll just install one of your fittings onto the front of the fuel pressure regulator like this, and the other will thread into this bottom. We'll snug those down later, but you can see this is how they are oriented. Lastly here, we need to get this gauge installed on the fuel pressure regulator, and it is just installed by first taking off this little grub screw right here. It was on there extremely tight. We untightened it off camera, but as you can see, this right here needed to get undone. And then we can just go ahead and take the nipple off of the fuel gauge. And before threading this into the fuel pressure regulator itself, we're going to go ahead and wrap it in some Teflon tape. The gauge did not come with that, so we had to get some ourselves. And that's about how you want it to look before installing it into the regulator. You don't want to over tighten anything, but you want all of these fittings to be snug enough that they are not going to leak. Remember, this is fuel that we are dealing with, so if any of this leaks, it is potentially very dangerous. With all of those fittings torqued down to what we felt was necessary, here is how it looks before we go installing it. moving into the engine bay here to get this mounted up to the vehicle. This worked out absolutely perfect. These two bolts that we're going to use on this existing bracket were spaced perfectly apart to just put our new fuel pressure regulator on top of it. It looks almost like an OEM install. This scene here may be a little tricky to see, but what we did was run our new vacuum line that we picked up from the auto parts store, and we put it onto our fuel pressure regulator, that little silver bit there. We just slipped it onto there and then cut it to length to reach that hard line that we pulled the vacuum line off of the old fuel pressure regulator. With that cut, we just went about routing it through the back side of the engine bay here and just connect it to that hard line like we said. If you end up getting at all confused with where this vacuum line goes or these upcoming fuel hoses, here's a little diagram that helped us out. It really helped to see that the fuel pressure regulator doesn't actually go on the inlet side of the fuel rail. It instead goes on the outlet side where the fuel is returning to the tank. That really helped us out in figuring out how these lines were located. Next step is to get the return side hose off of this hard line here. Then we're just going to go ahead and plug that into the bottom of our new fuel pressure regulator. Now we're just going to take a new bit of fuel line right here. We're going to plug this into the rightmost fitting here of our fuel pressure regulator. We'll get some hose clamps on that, and then we'll be ready to go ahead and install our ISR adapter fitting. Now, before installing this new adapter, there is one very important thing that we need to do, and that is to swap this small rubber grommet that you can see on the end of the old fuel regulator. If you do not swap this over to your new ISR adapter, it will leak. So super important, make sure that you do not rip it when you are taking it off of the old regulator. And once you are done taking it off of there, inspect it thoroughly to make sure that nothing has damaged it and that it is still of sound sealing potential. With that grommet transferred over to the new adapter here, we can go ahead and install it. This one is a lot simpler in terms of installation because all you have to worry about is those two screws to secure it to the fuel rail. You don't have to worry about that little vacuum hose that the old regulator had. And to finalize the install of that new adapter, all we need to do is go ahead and install that fuel line back onto it with a hose clamp. Finally, we can move on to our last step of the process, and that is to set our base fuel pressure with our new regulator. We want to take off the vacuum hose while doing this. First, we need to set our base fuel pressure without the vacuum hose attached, and then we will be able to attach our vacuum hose later on. Make sure, if you haven't already, to go ahead and plug the fuse into the fuse box for your fuel pump. It needs to be able to prime to see this pressure. As far as we've been able to gather, a good fuel pressure to have with no vacuum is around 40 psi, and with vacuum we are going to attempt to dial it in to about 35.5. We'll show you how to dial that in here in just a moment. If you are seeing absolutely no fuel pressure, look at your fuel lines. You may have them reversed. That is actually something that we did during the process of making this video, and it took us quite a while to figure it out, even though it seems like a very simple thing. To dial in the correct fuel pressure on our regulator, there is a lock nut on this silver portion of the top of the fuel pressure regulator that locks in another bolt that we can either turn in or out of the regulator, and that will give you more or less pressure depending on which way you turn that nut. Once you have the desired fuel pressure, then you can go ahead and tighten down that locking nut once again. So with things dialed in right about that 40 psi mark, we decided to go ahead and get the vacuum hose onto our fuel pressure regulator, jump back in the car, turn it over, and then with the car running, we could go ahead and dial it in further just to get it to that 35.5 psi mark. Well, how about that? We got 2 modifications done to the car for the price of 1 video. We still have some cleaning up to do, as you can see off camera. If you reach to this point in the video, it is very much appreciated, and we've also been appreciating so much the amount of interaction that you have all been showing us when we've been uploading recently. We've been getting in about 1 or 2 chats with people about every single time we upload, whether that be just troubleshooting or just general fun conversation. It has been really fun. At the current moment, not sure what we're going to be doing in the next video in the series. We have a parts pile underneath this table here, so we need to rummage through that, figure out what we're going to be doing. Until then, go check out our Instagram at team.blush. That's where we do a lot of behind the scenes stuff, and that is also the best bet in terms of getting into contact with us. Depending on what time it is for you currently, we hope that you have a good day or night. We hope to see you in another video on the channel, and as always, take it easy.